So, Emma, the change in regulations allowed a lot of companies to bring forward their plans, or at least thinking around private power. And I think now even more so with the uncertainty with electricity, with load shedding, and just the rising cost. So, can you just maybe spend a bit of time helping us unpack what is actually causing the shift towards private power?
Yeah, I think there's three main drivers. The first one is carbon goals. So a lot of the large corporates and industrials have their own individual carbon goals, and they have the responsibility of mitigating some of their carbon footprint that they have. And in doing so, they see the benefits of using renewable energy as a supply source to them to mitigate some of those effects, and are capitalizing on the opportunity to do that now with the change in regulation. The second large driver is around reliability. So load shedding has been a reality in South Africa since about 2007, 2008. And, with the increased impacts of load shedding, we've seen a lot of the mines looking at alternative solutions in order to try and mitigate the effects of the stop and start that they have on their production and the cost that's associated with that. And lastly, and it's a very big impact or driver not to be underestimated, is price. Just this year, NERSA has approved a price increase for Eskom, and so the cost of power that is supplied via our national grid is getting considerably more expensive over time, and that trend is expected to continue. Renewable energy offers a alternative green supply source at a lower tariff per kilowatt hour than what you get through the national grid. And it is a predictable price path because it's a fixed tariff that escalates at CPI for a long-term basis. So it gives corporates the ability to have predictability over one of their largest cost contributors to their bottom line. So those three drivers have been around for quite some time, like I said, 2007, 2008, and have over time have really created a large push for the consideration of private power. But as you so rightly mentioned, the Electricity Regulation Act previously prevented a lot of private power as an option for energy procurement for large corporates, and that was mostly because there was a restriction around the size of the project that could be traded or wheeled across the Eskom grid without having to get a NERSA license. So that size was previously set at 1 megawatt, which is a really low, it's a small size. So it didn't make it feasible for a lot of mines to procure 1 megawatt via on a wheeling basis. But over the course of 2021, 2022, there were changes to that act, and then there was subsequent relaxation of Schedule 2, which has now allowed that size to be 100 megawatts. So any project that is 100 megawatts or lower does not require to get a NERSA generation license in order to build a plant and then wheel power to private entities. So now, with the change, the ability to trade and wheel private power in South Africa has become a more realistic option for a lot of corporates. And so it's really been a catalyst for a massive private power boom in South Africa that we are currently seeing, and a trend that we continue to expect to see in the next few years.
And within these corporates, I mean, who are we seeing as the first movers, or at least the ones that are taking big advantages? Are we looking at mining companies, manufacturing, or industrial retail companies?
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, as you would expect, we really, the entities that saw this as an opportunity as soon as the regulation changed were the high intensity users in South Africa, whereby energy makes up a really massive cost component for them. And so almost all of the mining houses in South Africa have either already issued an RFP or are in the process of closing a private power project, or have an RFP out at the moment to procure private power via renewable resource. And we've seen that trend continue over the last sort of year to 18 months, and it's slowly starting to trickle down into other areas.
And I mean, what challenges have they faced? So those first movers, what have been most of the challenges that they faced and ways around it?
I think the first one is depending on what is driving your procurement of private power. If it is to avoid load shedding, then a project that wheels power from a site to the buyer will unfortunately still be caught out by load shedding, because the project and the buyer would still be reliant on the national grid to wheel power across. And so where load shedding is implemented either on the seller side or the buyer side, it would impact the ability of that project to transmit energy across the grid. Although renewable energy is not a silver bullet for load shedding, there are certain things that you can do to still mitigate the effects. One of those things is to have on-site battery storage, whereby batteries can then be used in the event of load shedding on the buyer side. Another possibility is to have a co-located plant. Now, that is only possible where there's land available at the site of the buyer. So, for example, a mine that has site available, and there they can have a co-located plant that has a direct feed from the plant into the buyer's site, and so they wouldn't be affected by load shedding in that instance. And there are mines that have undertaken this where they have space available. Harmony is a really good example of that. They got via an IPP model 30 megawatts built. Roughly just more than half of that was co-located. Another significant challenge is not all corporates or mines are connected to an Eskom grid. Some of them have a municipal connection. And what that basically means is that they make use of the municipality's national grid in that area, who then connects to Eskom in order to get their supply from the national grid. And unfortunately, in South Africa, not all municipalities have a wheeling framework. So the challenge that this poses is that it makes it incredibly difficult for you to procure power via an IPP model. So that really is a challenge. And I think going forward, there's going to have to be a lot of emphasis that is placed on assisting municipalities to develop wheeling frameworks in order to further facilitate the growth in the private power sector and in renewable energy in general. And in terms of a risk for the entire industry around renewable energy and also private power generation, a large constraint of the exponential growth that this industry has seen is that our transmission lines in the country are aging. And there are places in South Africa whereby capacity is now constrained. And what I mean by this is the ability for a seller of private power to set up a plant in an area of South Africa that has the best resource for that renewable energy, be it solar or wind, is sometimes constrained by the ability of our national grid to actually evacuate power out of that province. In South Africa, some of the best wind resources in the northern, western, and eastern Cape. And unfortunately, in those provinces, we are starting to see constraints on the national grid in terms of transmission lines in those areas, which means that it would effectively sterilize those provinces from setting up renewable energy plants. So in order for this industry to really grow in the way that it has recently, and in doing so to also relieve some of the generation capacity on Eskom, there's going to need to be a lot of capital expenditure invested in developing and growing our transmission lines in order to ensure security of future supply via renewable energy means.
Okay, so I mean, while it's still moving in the right direction, it has helped a lot. There's still very real challenges, as you've outlined, and I think a lot of work that still needs to go into it, for at least for the full benefit to be felt.